I'm Dr. Jen. I am a quilter and I will be working on scrap busting projects. So that is my goal for this evening. So we will talk about a couple different ways of having scraps that you have laying around, and then throughout the next couple weeks, we'll talk about how you can use those scraps. I am a quilter. I am also a sewist. I love sewing. Um, I really love to quilt. So I have a ton of projects that I work on. Um, and so I do love to do scrap busting projects. And so, for example, when I make stockings, this is all purple. And so, just a quick quilt as you go, and we make stockings out of them. And so, what happens is there's never, ever a time when you have a scrap that can't be used for something. So, for example, awesome. Everly, you were okay. That's what I'm talking about. Quilting and crocheting. I couldn't do the crocheting. I was like, that's just too much. Hey, how you doing, Miss Tammy? And no, I need to get with the post office. That's my next goal. So I haven't forgotten you, and I did get your message. But sometimes for me, even as a garment person, I have a lot of fabric left over. And it's easy for sewists to take fabric and throw it away. For quilters or for crafters, we absolutely can use this fabric for something. And so that's my biggest thing, is to be able to use this fabric some sort of way. As a quilter, there are always scraps, and we can use those scraps any sort of way. So we're going to do a quick patchwork project today. We can talk about how you can use that patchwork, how you can adapt it to do other types of quilting projects or craft projects. It could be anything that you would like it to be. So for me, when I get scraps like this, I try not to leave my scraps looking like this. I look at the scrap itself, and then I want to figure out how I can salvage as much of this as possible. So if I am a crafter and I can use a big piece of this for, let's say, the bottom of a bag, then what I want to do is cut off the excess parts and just give myself a square. And so in this case, well, actually it's more like a rectangle, right? So I can give myself a rectangle. I can fold this up, and then I can use it for something else. That leaves me with this piece here. When I take this piece here, this allows me to use a ruler, and I use my mat, and I would iron this, right? But I can line this up with my cutting mat. I'm going to cut off the wonky parts that aren't necessarily straight. And then I'll come in on the other side and I'll cut off those wonky parts. And I would iron this first just because that part is sitting up, but I'm going to cut that off. But I would cut these off. Get them as close to an inch or a quarter of an inch that I possibly can get them. If working in whole numbers works for you, then you can absolutely do this in inches. So I'm going to go, this is going to be a 4-inch piece, and I'm just going to cut that excess off. So this will give me a strip of fabric that I can then use for something else. So, Miss Charmaine, I am going to be doing patchwork today using scraps. So today it is all about the scraps. When I have pieces left like this, I like to shred them. And then they will go into a scrap pile that I'll show you in a minute. Okay. So I will arrange all my scraps, and let me not knock the scrap pile over again because I did that earlier. And let me show you what I do with my scraps. So again, as a quilter, but even as a bag person, what you can do is create, usually for binding, are 2-inch strips. And then when you create those 2-inch strips, you can put them all in a container. And then when you need them, you have them for binding. So if you are working on a bag and it needs to be bound, you have a container that will carry all of your 2.5-inch strips that you can use later for binding. Now, 9 times out of 10, this is not bias binding. It's usually cut on the straight or against the grain. It's not cut on that angle that gives you the pull. So you can get this all set up. Here are all of the binding pieces that I have left over. I have them rolled up and pinned, and they're just sitting over here on this side. And then these are all my strips here. So if I am going to do something with strips and I need some extra strips, I can go here to get them, or I can get some pieces of binding, maybe for a mug rug or a placemat, something that may need a smaller piece of binding. So we do not get rid of scraps. If I'm not using the strips, then I have bigger pieces like I had here with this one, and I place them in this container, and this is more of my garment stuff. So I have a lot of, this container has a lot of the Ankara fabric in it that I use. And this is what I'm going to be using today to make my blocks. I've already cut 2, but I have all of the strips that are different, all of the different pieces of fabric that are different sizes. And they are in this container. And we'll be using these today. Okay. So I separate out everything. Usually when I'm watching TV or I'm watching a live, I can go through my scraps and I can organize and separate them so that they exist the way that I need them to, and then I can pull them out as needed. So if you are a bag maker or you are a garment maker, and one of the things somebody asked me to make a patchwork skirt, and so absolutely, here you go. This is the fabric for the patchwork skirt. So I don't have to buy yardage for that skirt because I have plenty of fabric in here to make that scrappy skirt for them. Hey, Miss Sabs, how are you? And I am currently working on my squares. So I have these squares here. And don't ask me where I have, but I have a bunch of squares somewhere, and it's probably in one of those containers over there that I don't feel like getting up to get. But I will take and cut like 5-inch squares because I typically use what's called a charm square, which is a 5-inch square. So I will stack those in these boxes, and then I'll have them if I need to make a scrappy project. So what do I do with the teeny tiny scraps? And we do not want to knock this over. But here are my teeny tiny scraps. And these are all shredded up. And I will shred some more today. But I keep these because I can shred these up. And then I can use these to create pillow forms. So instead of going to the store and purchasing a pillow form, I can use leftover fabric, and I can use these shredded pieces of fabric to create the pillow forms. So as I am creating projects, whatever I'm doing, I just shred it as I go. Okay, so we're going to set this aside. And we're going to get started on a simple patch. It's a great way, Miss Tammy, of getting rid of all those little pieces. I will scrap up cotton. I will try to scrap up any lightweight fabric. I will scrap up knit. I will scrap up lining fabric. So anything that can kind of form and make like that pillow form shape for me that I can scrap up and scrap up easily, that's what I would do. I've never tried vinyl. However, I'll say this. If I can get the vinyl scraps, because I don't make that much in vinyl, I could probably get the vinyl scraps in there too, and I can do that as well. So absolutely, Teacher TB, you can make dog beds out of them as well. The only suggestion that I would give, if you're going to do the dog bed, I do a double piece. So I make the pillow and then I make the pillow cover. And that's just because some dogs have nails. And if you use a cotton, sometimes they're going to tear up that cotton. So you may want to use a more durable fabric like an upholstery or something like that to go over top of it. But I like to make the pillow form itself because it's easier to wash the cover than it is to wash the whole pillow, because once you put those scraps in there, it gets heavy and it gets really hard to carry. You're taking that puppy to the laundromat. Okay, so I have my Ankara scraps here, and I'm going to open these up if I can get them open. And I need, for this project, I am going to do a simple patchwork. So I am going to do this 20 by 20. And we'll talk about the measurements, and we're going to talk about the seams as we go. This is my ruler that I like to use when I'm doing charm packs. So this is a 5-inch square rule. And the size of a regular charm pack is 5-inch square. So this allows me to cut exactly what a charm pack could be. Hold off, Jen, I don't have 50 billion rulers. So absolutely, if you have a regular ruler like this size, you can use it and you can mark off your 5 by 5, and you can use tape if you need to mark it off. A great way of doing it is using painter's tape so that you see the 5 by 5. But yeah, I don't like to do that. So if I can help it, for me, I prefer to just use something that's easier. So I buy things for convenience. So this is my convenience square that I like to purchase. Again, that's just me. That's how I like to do it. Everybody does things differently. And I always tell people, quilting is not a cheap hobby. However, you can make it cheaper depending on where you shop and, if you're okay doing things a longer way. So if I prefer to use a bigger ruler and then mark it off, I can make it cheaper because I only have then one ruler that I'm using rather than 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 18 rulers. And I have a lot of rulers. Hey, RV. Hey, Janine. So for example, I have this big ruler, which is 14 by 14. And if you're going to use a ruler like this, like you only buy one of these, but these aren't cheap. So I can still find the markings for 5 inches and use this. So I only buy one ruler rather than buying a 2.5-inch ruler, a 5-inch ruler, an 8-inch ruler, a 12-inch ruler, and a 14-inch ruler. So instead of having all those rulers, I can just buy this one and then just mark off the spaces that I need for each type of square that I want. Totally up to you. You also have your cutting mat that you can use as a guide to help you cut if you have straight rulers like this. So you could use any sort of ruler that you want, but just for me in my house, I prefer to buy the rulers that work for me because I am all about the convenience. Okay, so I go through my stash, and the only requirements that I have for my stash as I am doing this, and some of these are already the right size. Whew. So the only requirements that I have for these is that this has to be at least 5 inches. In width for 5-inch square. So this one is already 5 inches because there were some that I was cutting down and I was like, you know, I just made them 5-inch square because that's how big they were. I don't want a lot of these, so I think I will just use those 2. And then I'll put these back into my scrap pile because I do want this to be as scrappy as possible. Because the ruler is going to fit inside of this, then the great thing about it is that I just place the ruler where I need it to go and I can just cut off all of that excess to get my 5-inch piece. Patchwork can be any size square that you want it to be. So that means that you can make this as small as 2 inches. You could make it 1 inch. That's like a postage stamp, but ain't nobody got time to be sewing all that together. But, you know, if you like it, I love it. And then when I have this piece left over, I can either decide to use this piece for something and place it into another scrap bin, or I can scrap it up. So that's totally to be me. Okay, if I scrap it up, and I try not to get my fingers in the mix, I'm just shredding it like this. And then I take it off my table and I place it into my scrap bin. But that just depends. I could really have used that for something, but you know, just to show you what I do to get rid of the scraps, that's what I do. So I pull another piece up. I get it as close to the edge as I possibly can. And I am going to cut off the edges. And again, remember, you're making this as big as you want it to be. The bigger it is, the wider the space that it takes up, the less that you'll need of it. The smaller it is, the more that you will need. These are too tiny for anything, and I'll just scrap those up. So your scrap, when you're making something for your patchwork, whether it's a quilt, whether it's a bag, it could be a pillow, and that's what I am going to work on today, is just making a pillow cover. I can decide how big I want them to be. Depending on the design, especially when working with Ankara, sometimes the design will get lost depending on how small the fabric cut is. So that's totally up to you to decide what you want that to look like. And again, I'm just pulling my scraps. If they are 5 inches, they work for me. If they are not at least 5 inches square, then I'm just pulling another piece to get to what I need. If I want 2 of them, and this is double, I can go ahead and double them. The material right now that I am scrapping up, I am throwing it into a scrap bin, and I am going to use that as the stuffing for the pillow. I put this, and I will encase this in a pillow, what I'm going to call a pillow form, just because I like to be able to put it in something a little bit more durable than the cotton. And I like to take my covers off and exchange them. I don't like them to be on there permanently, because I can change those pillow forms out for the seasons, for the decor. So I have like a ton of pillow covers that I like to use. So I don't like to create the pillow and then seal it up, and then there's no way to change it out when I'm tired of looking at that particular cover. So for example, I have pillows that are specifically for Valentine's Day. So once Valentine's Day is over, I need a new form. And I don't want to create another pillow, because then where are you putting all those pillows in your house? So it is much easier to stack the pillow covers somewhere in your house than it is to stack the pillows. Ask me how do I know? Because I have a bunch of pillows in my house that I moved some of them to the back porch, and then I did some other things with them because I had too many forms in the house, and I was like, what are you doing with all those pillows? So I had to learn the hard way that I didn't need all these. These are too small. I think this one's too small too. So I'm just measuring each one to see if it lines up to inside of my square. My square is 5 inches. And if it lines up with the square, then I am cutting a 5-inch square block. And I need, for my measurements, for what I'm thinking, about 20 of them. So I am cutting out 20 of those squares. Okay, and then I can show you again the scraps. So I keep all this stuff by my machine when I am doing any sort of sewing, because I can easily just cut everything up, scrap it up, and then I have exactly what I need for whatever project I'm working on later. And then when I have enough of the fluff, then I can make the pillow. And in some cases, because I consider this to be free. So scraps are things that we were going to possibly discard anyway, have sitting in a bag somewhere, donate to charity, do whatever we were going to do with it. But it was considered a free project. So if I make a pillow for somebody out of scraps, then my philosophy, my thinking is that this was a free project that I made for that person. So it really didn't cost me anything other than time. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to charge them for a pillow if I have to make it, but I at least know that, it wasn't like a whole lot of money. If I'm making a scrappy quilt, it's the same thing. I'm just pulling all the scraps out of my stash. I am scrapping everything up, and then I can use that for a rag quilt, or I can use it just as a patchwork quilt. So it's totally up to you how you want to use the scraps. But again, I'm just going through these right now. And I have my boxes on the floor right here in front of me. And I'm just leaning over and picking up whatever scraps that I find that are at least 5 or more inches square, so that I can cut my charm squares. And again, a standard measurement in quilting is 5 inches for a charm square, is what it's called. So if you are making a quilt and they tell you that it calls for charm squares, those are 5-inch squares. And roll wrap, if you want to change the size of your squares, that is up to you. Squares are the easiest thing to change up. So you can also take what is called a layer cake, and you can cut that into 4s, because a layer cake are 10-inch squares, and that will give you 4 charm squares. Oops. Okay. And we'll just shred that up. Now, ask me if I counted anything to see how many I have of these. So I probably should. If I don't have 20, I have close to 20. How long does it take to make a quilt? So, Miss Tammy, it depends. Last night, to make the quilt top that I made last night, the Radiant Star, I was online running my mouth for 2 hours, and the whole Radiant Star quilt top was done in 2 hours. Now, we know that running your mouth distracts you, so it may not have taken me 2 hours. had I have not been running my mouth on live, which is fine. So I would say that it probably would have taken me an hour, maybe an hour and a half to do that quilt top. So there is the piecing of the quilt. So these are the quilt pieces, and when I sew these together, I'm piecing the quilt top. When I finish the quilt top and I put the quilt top on top of the batting and the backing, I have what's called a quilt sandwich. And then the stitches that I put over that to hold everything together is actually called the quilting. That process could take, again, a little bit of time depending on the size of your quilt, because you have to base that whole thing together. And then you have to decide what type of design, if you will, what type of quilt design you want on it. The looser the quilt design, the less time it'll take. The more intricate the quilt design, the longer it will take. So a quilt could take anywhere from a couple hours to make to a couple days. Or it could take a couple months depending on how detailed that quilt is. So sometimes when you go to a quilt show and you see some of the quilts that are there, those quilts may have taken people over a year to make. And sometimes it's not a year of straight sewing, because sometimes you have to audition your fabric. You have to think about what your design is going to look like. How are you going to thread it? How are you going to quilt it? And inspiration doesn't always happen like right there in that moment. So you may have one thought, and then when you put everything together, you come up with something else and you say, oh, I'd rather do this, or I think this would really look good. Sometimes you don't have everything, especially when you embellish a quilt. And so when I made my mask time quilt, which is downstairs, and that is a simulation of an African mask, that I didn't know what kind of embellishments I want in it. So I had to let it sit for a minute until I went to, I think it was New York maybe. And when I saw the feathers, I was like, yup. And then one day I went to Joann's and I saw the trim and I was like, yep. And so then I was able to put it together because I finally had the complete inspiration to make the quilt. So sometimes it's hard to say how long it could take, but I could absolutely put a quilt together in a matter of a couple hours and then take it to the machine, do a simple stitch for quilting it, and I could have that quilt done in a day, the whole thing. So it just depends on what you're working on. And you're talking about art when we're saying like a year. And again, we're not talking about this person sitting there for a whole year making the quilt. We put it down. We think about what we're doing. We start all over again. We rip stuff out. We audition. We say this doesn't work, so we're going to go over it quite a few times. Hey, how are you doing, Miss Livette? How is everyone? Again, welcome in, welcome in. Trying something new here. I'm trying to go live more because, I've been getting some things in my inbox like, when are you going live? So I am trying to do some different things. And so this is all about the scraps. For this, everything now is 5 inches. So with these scraps, I want to lay the scraps out, and depending on how many different types of fabrics I use, my only rule for me when I am doing something scrappy is to make sure that I don't have the same fabrics touching. That's all I care about. And I, in some cases, don't want the same colors to touch. Again, that's your personal preference. Depending on what you're making, when you sew these together, this is 5 inches plus 5 inches plus 5 inches, let's say, plus 5 inches. Let's just do 4. So these 4 together on my mat will equal 20 inches. But of course, we know that our fabric doesn't lay together side by side and then it's done. You're going to stitch them together and use a seam. So for this seam, then Yes, you should get a big mat, Miss Donna. So for this seam, when you quilt, we usually use a 1/4 inch. When you're making garments, there's a lot of stress on your fabric, so you use a wider seam. For quilting, we don't have that kind of stress, so we use a narrower seam. So when I take these two and put these two together, they start off as 10 inches. But when I actually sew them at the 1/4 inch, when I open these back up, I'm losing a 1/4 inch off of this one. I'm losing a 1/4 inch off the bottom one. So together, 10 inches minus 2/4, which is a half, would give me a 9.5 inch on this side rectangle. So it would be 9.5 inches by 5. So every time I sew two of these together, I lose a 1/2 inch. So if I sew these four, then I'm going to lose a 1/2 inch here, a 1/2 inch here, and a 1/2 inch here. So that's 1.5 inches. So if this started off as 20 minus 1.5 inches, which should give me an 18.5 inch strip. And this is still by 5 inches because I haven't done anything to this side. So if I'm going to make a, let's say, quilt out of this, or we won't be here all day for the quilt, but if I were going to make a quilt out of this, I would determine how many blocks I need, knowing that at each seam, I'm losing a 1/2 inch. So that's how you figure out how many blocks you're going to need going across. If I'm making a table runner, which would be shorter, again, I would determine the length of the table, and then I would determine how many blocks I need, and then remember that I'm losing a 1/2 inch in there. And that's provided that you are only doing the 1/4 inch. If your seams go wider than a 1/4 inch, you're losing more of that fabric as you go. So I am doing this 4x4, and I'm going to do 4 rows down. So I should have an 18.5 inch square by the time I finish. That's the goal. Okay, so we're going to get started with this. This is going to be my first row. And I'm just going to take my fabrics. And the one thing that I love about Ankara is that it's hard to read which side is the right side and which side is the wrong side. So I have to pay attention a little bit more there. I'm going to line my fabrics up, right sides together. I have a 1/4 inch foot because I like to cheat. And I don't believe in working harder again. I pay for convenience. So you could just mark your 1/4 inch on your machine. If you have a 1/4 inch guide, you could use that. I'm not doing that because I have a 1/4 inch foot. And then what you do is then you take the next two and you put them together, and we call this chain piecing because you can keep going. And we have 16 blocks that we need to put together. So I can just go ahead and continuously put all of these together. And I know this has a, yep, there it is. Until I have 8 sets of 2. And then I will worry about rearranging these when I get them there. But that's my thing. And again, this is scrappy. And I am getting rid of scraps. And I am just making a quick throw pillow. But again, this could be anything that you want it to be. So it could be a placemat. It could be a quilt if you really want to get that many blocks done. And if you are somebody who has a friend who does your clothing. So I noticed that the fitness fairy came in. And so when she comes in, she likes to get her African print garbs made. And instead of allowing the seamstress to keep your scraps, get your scraps because you could do something else with them. And so, no, Carmen, it's called convenience. And so it is not cheating. It's called working smarter, not harder. I don't feel any kind of way about Joann's closing because I mean, it is what it is in this day and age. Hancock's closed. You know, there are other shops back in the day. We had the mill shop. We won't discuss how long ago that was, where I could buy my fabric. And I didn't pay half as much as I'm paying now. And I still have some of that fabric in my stash. But that's beside the point. So I mean, you know, it is what it is. And, you know, it's like, okay, that run of 50% off or 40% off could only last but so long. So unfortunately, you know, I feel bad. I feel bad for the jobs lost. I feel bad for, you know, people that have to find ways to shop. But I also understand in this day and age, you know, there is online shopping. And that is not something that I had when I was growing up. We couldn't go online. We had to go to the shop. So I had to get on the bus and figure out how to get to the shop to buy whatever it was that I needed to buy. And when I went to the mill shop, yeah, I had to get on quite a few buses to get where I had to go. So, you know, it kind of is what it is. A lot of quilters. So there were some good fabrics in Joann's that we could use. They were quilters cotton. They were not bad fabrics. To be quite honest with you, even the calicos were okay. Again, you buy, I always have been of the mindset that you buy what you can afford. So at some point when I first started quilting, that's what I used. I used what was in Joann's until I became a quilt snob. And I went to the quilt shops and was like, oh, I need to be buying quilting fabric. And then I started buying quilting fabric. So I just became a snob that way. But, you know, that really had nothing to do with anything but the fact that, you know, they said that the quality was better. And I was like, oh, it is. But I do like going to the quilt shops. And I'll tell you why I like going to the quilt shops. When you go to Joann's, all you see is a bolt of fabric. When you go to Hobby Lobby, all you see is a bolt of fabric. When you go to a quilt shop, you see what the bolt of fabric could be because they have examples of those quilts in their shops. And they will sell you the kit and they will help you pick out the fabric if you have a specific quilt that you want to make. These people are usually the experts of the quilts. And so they can really help you a lot more than some of the Joann's people could. So that's one of the reasons why I like going there. This machine is a Husqvarna Viking. So this is a machine that I purchased at Joann's. And again, this was convenient at the time when I first started quilting. I had my other machine. I was still working with garments. I went to Joann's because that was close. It was convenient. And then as I ventured out to the quilt shops, I was like, oh, they like Bernina. They like Janome. But I had my rider, and that's downstairs, the Emerald, and the Emerald worked for me just fine. So I kept using it. And I love the line, and why change it if you like it? I drive Toyotas. That's all I've ever driven other than my Nissan Sentra. That's what I like. So I do stick with certain name brands just because I like them better. Once everything is stitched together, then I can stitch the twos together to make fours. Now I can either stitch these together in rows and then stitch the rows together, or I can stitch these to make 4 patches. And then they will look like this, and then stitch the 4 patches together. It's totally up to you which way you want to go. Some people prefer that when the rows are long, they prefer to do the 4 patches just because it's a lot easier to square things up. And sometimes it gets a little wonky when you have a long line of blocks that you need to sew together. Awesome. Yes, I am a fellow quilter. I love quilting. I love using the scraps. Let me back up for a second. When you are, and I'll come in for this. Now, right, Carmen, I didn't press. I do a little finger pressing. I do press from time to time with the iron, but for the 4 patches, I can just do a quick finger press. And what I am doing is matching the seams up. I keep my seams open. I keep my seams to one side. So I press to one side. They're going in opposite directions. And then what I can do is just line those seams up and they'll actually lock, which is called like a nest. They'll nest together, and that will help me to get a great match when I sew these together. Because I am not using a pin or a clip for this, I am holding the seam just so it doesn't shift on me. So you can use your pins, you can use your clips. If you like to live dangerously like I do, you don't use them. Okay, I could go and do the whole chain, but I just want to show you that because I held that way, notice how all those seams line up. Now, that doesn't always happen, but I just wanted to show you that it absolutely will if you take your time and you're paying attention to what you do. So it really does make sense for you not to go fast, to really pay attention to what's going on, because when you are doing this as best as you possibly can, you do want all those seams to meet up, and you don't want them to be off. Hey, Anna. I was talking about you yesterday. This is I have my big mat that's down here on this machine, and I do have my big mat that's downstairs. I have 4. I did not bring upstairs the one on the turntable. I should have. But we won't discuss that. And then I have a shorter one. So, I have 4 of them. So I do love the big mat. I love the length of the big mat, and I love the width of it, especially because it fits on all of the tables that I have them on. I'm opening these up. And again, I'm lining up. I'm nesting those seams. One's going in one direction, one's going in the other. And again, I will say this to you. Thank you for tapping the screen. Thank you for the likes. What I will say is that it's up to you whether you want those seams open or closed. So I am not here to tell you to keep those seams closed and iron them to one side. I'm not telling you that you can't iron them open. It is totally up to you. But I would say in most cases, pick a team. Now, what I will also say is that if you have a lot of seams that are all meeting in the same place, you also need to make a decision over what will work best, because you don't want all of those seams laying on one side piled up, because it will get bulky. And then it's time to use a clapper or a roller and, really get the pressing that little puppy down so that you don't have a big bulky bulge, for lack of a better word, in the center of those squares or any other shape that you may have. Okay, and then we will put this together. And again, this is the same process for whatever you're making. So, for example, on Saturday, if I am on with Miss Shamir and Miss Nikki, and we are working, I wouldn't do this size. I would go a little bit smaller, but we could make the chandler and quilt the fabric. Probably would use 3-inch squares, but I could make this a quilted piece, and I could for the chandler bag, and then I could use that to, you know, for the outside of that bag. So again, using my scraps. So my 4s are all sewn together. Now it would be nice if I press these. And this is just nice because, you know, you don't want to wait too long to press. So it just makes sense to press. They say as you go, but I press every so often. And that's just me. So I'll show you the little janky board. I do want to show you this. Because I press the seams faux pressed, right, for right now, because I'm getting ready to really press them, you'll notice the seams are going almost in a circle. And that is going to be perfect for me for this look. I could have this seam go up and this seam go down and then press these to the right or the left, or I could have it go all the way around. And I'm going to have it go all the way around. I take my iron and I'm just going to press those seams down. You don't want to iron. So your ironing is, you know, when you're doing this, because you don't want to distort your fabric. When you're working with quilt box, there tends to be some precision to this. And because there's some precision, what happens is if you distort your block and now you make it like a 6 1/4 instead of a 6 by 6, then it will throw off the way that it looks and it'll start to get wavy on you. Now what I'm doing is I'm picking out a couple of those stitches in the center, and I'll show you what that looks like. And I can use my nail and I'm just going to press that down. And I'll show you that center. And you can see it right there. So it's going to naturally do that because of the way that I laid this, and it allows me to pick this out. So then what happens is it's going to help this to lay even flatter. So that lays nice and flat. If it doesn't lay as flat as I like, best press is my friend. I give it a little bit of a spray, and then I can use my iron and I can really make those seams lay flat. It's best press is nothing more than starch. You can use regular starch. So I like best press, honestly, because I like the smell of it. But it also doesn't leave that white residue. Okay. And then there we go. So again, Tammy, it is up to you. You can open the seams or you can close the seams. Because I did some spray starching in advance, you'll notice it's not raveling as much as it could ravel if I didn't starch this at all. And the Ankara, for the most part, really doesn't unravel as much as quilter's cotton does. So that's the great thing about Ankara. But these are all of the skirts and dresses so far that I've probably made to date. And this is not going in the direction I want it to. I want this all to go this way. So when I make this, right, if I were to make this into a bag, this would match every skirt or dress that I have. And again, I come in and I just kind of play with a few of those stitches just to kind of pop this open a little bit. And you don't do a lot of back stitching with the pieces. I can pop it with a little bit of my best press, and then I can just pop this down a little bit. Absolutely, absolutely. And so a lot of times in my comments, and I do answer all of my comments, I'll get questions. And so then I am real, I just really like to make sure that I answer any questions that are there. Okay, so we have 2. We need 2 more to make my 16 by 16. And again, when I say 16 by 16, I don't mean 16 by 16 inches. I'm saying 16 by 16. Well, it's not 16 by 16, it's 4 by 4. So maybe that's a better statement that I should make. So I am working on my 4 by 4. And I'm going to pop this open. And I'm just using my nails. And I'm just moving it. And you really don't even need nails to do this. But Carmen set the bar with the nails. So now I have to get my nails done because she done set the bar with it. But I'm not getting those long nails. Yes, ma'am. So if you have a lot of Ankara or any type of cotton fabric, you absolutely can use it. And again, there are, like, what I found interesting, right, is that some of the Ankara print that they sell in the store now is patchwork, because they recognized that people like quilters were taking that leftover Ankara and they were making patchwork with it and then using that to make outfits. So absolutely, it's the perfect way. It takes a little bit more time, but it helps you to get the look that you're going for with the Ankara scraps. And why throw those scraps out? Now, and I feel some sort of way when, like Will could give me all them scraps rather than putting them in a pillow. So you don't have to have a hotter iron. You could use, like I said, a little bit of breast press, and then it will help to kind of lay these things down. So this Panasonic is not as hot as my Chi that I use when I iron my clothes. Uh-oh, there goes that person that deserted me. She's in the live. I see her. Hey, Miss Rosalind. I was talking trash about you last night. I just want you to know that. You and Kashana, I was talking trash about y'all. Okay, so I have my 4. And so here is a 4 patch. So 1, 2, 3, 4 patches. And these 4 patches are going to make a 4 patch. So I'll have 2 up top and 2 down bottom. And so I will stitch these together. If I'm not paying attention to my seams, they may not go in the right direction, opposite directions. And if they don't, that's fine. I just need to make sure that I nest them together. And again, I can use a pin or a clip if needed. Is it Tootie B? Hey, Tootie B. And I'll take it back to my machine. And I am going to do both of them just because... why, if I can chain, why not? And again, this is a great way, as I encourage you to use your scraps and not to throw those scraps away. We can absolutely use these to make garments. We can absolutely use these to make quilts. So this could be a mini quilt. This could be your table runner. This could be a pillow cover. This could be the beginning of a jacket or a skirt. This could be part of a jacket. There are so many uses that you could use this for, because what we're doing, just like the jelly roll race, is we're creating, if you will, a piece of fabric with the scraps. The seam allowance is a quarter inch, excuse me. Ooh, is a quarter inch. So usually when you're quilting, most of your seam allowances are always a quarter inch. Okay. So here is one row. And if I did this correctly, and I measure this, and you can't see it at the angle that I'm at, this measures 18 and a half. And that's what I said from the beginning. And I'll just say that again. Each one of these squares was 5 inches. So that's 5, 10, 15, 20. They get joined by a seam allowance. So that's a quarter taken off of this side and a quarter taken off of this side. So a quarter and a quarter or a half. So we lost a half of an inch for a seam allowance here, a half here, and a half here. So that's 1 half plus 1 half is 1, plus another half is 1.5. So 20 inches minus 1.5 should give you 18.5. This way here was 2 5s with a half taken out. So if I measure this, this should be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and a half. So if I'm using the 1/4 inch foot the way that the 1/4 inch foot should be done, then I need to make sure that I am, getting my measurements, and I do measure. So, and I measure, especially if I'm working on a project that needs to be measured, because I don't want any surprises. So I don't want to get to the end of the quilt and find out that I was a half inch off, because that will make a difference in the final project, in the final product. Okay, so I'm pressing that one out. And let me see. Nope, don't want it to go that way, because then those two will touch. That can go that way. So I'm going to press this seam this way. And again, I just like to hit it with a little best press. You could use water. You could use a different type of starch. That is totally up to you. Okay, I'm going to lay these together. So Miss Rosalind, we're just working on scraps, and I am just going to do a simple little scrappy project today, working with 5-inch squares, like charm squares, and this can be turned into like a pillow cover. What I am doing now is measuring up my seams. I'm lining up, I should say, my seams, and I am using a clip. When I have a lot of seams that I'm using, I either want to use a pin or I want to use clips to make sure that they all line up. When you sew, sometimes out of habit, when we're holding the fabric, we will stretch it just a little bit. And you don't want to stretch it so much that your seams don't line up the way that you want. I'd rather have forgiveness on the edges than to have my seams not line up. And that's just me. So I try at all costs just to make sure that my seams line up. Okay. And we're going to take this back to the machine. Pull the clip out. Sometimes the hook, that little lead for your foot, when you're using the 1/4 inch foot, will get stuck on your fabric or on your thread. So you just have to kind of be careful and adjust it. Okay. Now, one of the things that I learned from Mr. Will is that when he does his, and I never thought about this, when he cuts off his whoops, there's that little puzzle piece coming up. And I don't know. I hate when it's like, is it my hand and eye coordination? I think that's what it is. It's my fan. It's my hand. There it is. Okay. So it's my hand and eye coordination. What he does is he likes to cut the threads and then he throws those into his scrap pile. So he throws it all into the scrap pile. So my machine is, this one here is the Husqvarna Viking Opal 650. I do have a Husqvarna Viking Emerald 116 downstairs. I also have a Janome, and don't ask me what the number is because I'm going to forget. That is the newest machine to the pile of machines that I have. I won that this summer at a quilt shop hop. Well, no, I won that this fall at a quilt shop hop. And so, yeah, I'm still getting used to that one and calling that one by name. And this didn't go the way I wanted to, so I'm just going to press that over. Thank you, thank you, thank you for the follow. Thank you so much for tapping the screen with the likes. I appreciate you, and I appreciate you hanging out with me. So we have been on for about an hour with me running my mouth. And here is the final piece for this. So this, again, should be, keyword is should, this should be 18.5 inches square. So if I want this to be the pillow, then the pillow cover, then either I can get a plain piece of fabric and I can make a quilt sandwich out of this and then quilt it. And then I can use this as the top, and then I can put the two pieces on the back if I'm going to do the zipper or the envelope method, so I can choose what I want this to look like. But this is just what we like to call the quilt top. So this is a very simple and easy thing to do using up your scrap fabric. And again, this can sit anywhere and it could be anything. So this could be a table mat. You could add just a piece of batting in here along with a backing and make just like a quick envelope type pillow type look. Just turn it inside out and not have any borders on it and like make life easy for you. So there's a lot of things that you can do on it. Yeah, I want the zipper on the back side. That's what I plan to do with this. But like I said, for me, I would prefer, I don't want this raw edge to show. Some people don't care if the raw edges show on the inside. Me, I don't like that raw edge to show. So sometimes I like to quilt it. Tammy, for you, this could be the base for a bag. So you could absolutely use this to make a tote bag and just use your scraps that you've put together to create this, in this case, 18.5 square piece, or you could add another layer. So then it would now be 25. It would be 5 by 5. Or you could make it 6 by 6 and make it 36 squares. So you could make it as big as you want. You could make it as long as you want. And then you could use this as your tote bag. So now I can cut my Tuesday tote out of this and use this as the either outside, or I could use this as the inside. You could use your softer vinyl and then patchwork that. So if you're thinking, Miss Tammy, about like you have those pieces of vinyl left over and you're like, what do I do with them? Quilt them. So you could absolutely use those colors and create a block style look that you could use for your bags. And again, you could go with a smaller block if it's a smaller type bag. Again, I'm not going too small because I'm not doing all that work, but you absolutely could do that. One of the other things you could do is you could slice this. So you could sew all these blocks together and then you could subcut them. going across, which would give you strips. So there's plenty of things you can do with it to manipulate it. But this absolutely can look any way that you want. You don't have to use all the colors that I use, so it doesn't have to be psychedelic. I can continue to build this out and make this a cute little African print scrappy quilt out of this if I choose. This could be a baby quilt, and I could make a matching pillow with it out of any of these. So this can totally look any way that you want it to. So again, just real quick and easy, I have all of my scraps, and you see it didn't make a dent, right? So it's still full. I have plenty of scraps that can be used in there that I can bring down to that 5-inch square in my pack. If they are smaller than that, and somebody asked about it earlier, I shred those pieces so they look like this, and then this is what I'm going to use to stuff the pillow with. So I can absolutely use this to stuff the pillow. Miss Tammy, you absolutely can block a memory blanket and use the shirts and things from somebody's clothing to create this look. So instead of having different sizes, you can use all one size. So again, totally up to you how you want to do it. But the great thing about this is that this is just a standard 5-inch block. You make the block the size you want. The bigger the block, the bigger the area. So you could use a 10-inch block. You could use an 8-inch block. You could use a 3-inch block. You could use a 2.5-inch block. I wouldn't dare, but you could use a 1-inch block. And I do have 1-inch blocks, and those 1-inch blocks, if you sew them, you're going to lose a 1/2 inch on one side. You're going to use a 1/4 inch on one side, 1/4 inch on the other side, all the way around. So you're going to be left with a small little 1/2 inch block. That's going to be a 1/2 inch finished block. So you absolutely could do that, and there are plenty of people that do it, but I'm not one of them. So you can absolutely do that as well.